Hello, friends. On the first episode of an ex-Catholic's examination of Eucharistic miracles, I took a look at the miracle of Lanciano. Since that was my first review, I ranked it as S tier, though I did note that the miracle was not enough to convince me of its authenticity due to the lack of peer-reviewed journal articles and the 1200-year gap between the date of supposed occurrence and the testing. Today, we're going to take a look at the Eucharistic miracles at Buenos Aires. Will the miracles at Buenos Aires unseat Lanciano from S tier? Stay tuned to find out. I picked Lanciano for episode 1 because that was the first Eucharistic miracle discussed in the very first video that shows up on YouTube when you search for Eucharistic miracles. So I think it's fitting that for episode 2, we discuss the second miracle discussed in that same video. Take it away, Kiwi narrator.
At 7 o'clock, August 18th, 1996, Father Alejandro Pizzet was saying Holy Mass at a Catholic church in Buenos Aires, Argentina. After distributing Holy Communion, a woman came up to tell him that she had found a discarded host on a candle holder at the back of the church. Since he was unable to consume it, Father Pizzet placed it in a dish of water and stored it in the tabernacle. However, coming back on Monday, August the 26th, he came into the church, opened the tabernacle, and to his amazement, he found that the host had turned into a bloody substance. He reported the miracle to Cardinal Jorge Bergoglio, the future Pope Francis, who told him to have it professionally photographed. These photos were taken on September the 6th, 1996.
Wait, pause. Does that one in the upper left kind of look like mold to you?
For several years, the host remained in the tabernacle with everything kept under strict secret. Since the host suffered no visible decomposition,
Are we sure that's not mold? Okay, continue.
Cardinal Bergoglio decided to have it scientifically analysed. Since they did not want to prejudice the study, they purposely did not inform the team of scientists of its origin. One of those scientists was Dr. Frederick Zugabar
Remember that name, we're gonna come back to him.
of Columbia University, the well-known cardiologist and forensic pathologist. He determined that the analyzed substance was real flesh and blood containing human DNA. Zugabar testified that the analyzed material is a fragment of the heart muscle found in the wall of the left ventricle close to the valves. The heart muscle is an inflammatory condition and contains a large number of white blood cells. This indicates that the heart was alive at the time the sample was taken, since white blood cells die outside of a living organism. They require a living organism to sustain them. Thus, their presence indicates that the heart was alive when the sample was taken. What is more, these white blood cells had penetrated the tissue, which further indicates that the heart had been under severe stress, as if the owner had been beaten severely about the chest.
You know what's funny about this clip? Is that somehow this video both undersold and oversold this miracle claim. Let's start with the underselling. I'm saying undersell because this is actually at least 3 different miracle claims, or 5 if you split the first one into 3. Jimmy Akin in episode 220 of Mysterious World listed as 5 miracles, and he takes this from the 2021 book, A Cardiologist Examines Jesus, the Stunning Science Behind Eucharistic Miracles, by Dr. Serafini. Jimmy says,
This case was actually a set of 5 reported miracles that occurred in the 1990s. 3 of them in 1992, 1 in 1994, and 1 in 1996. And all of them occurred in the same parish.
These 3 or 5 miracles occurred in 92, 94, and 96. The first 1 or 3 miracles, depending on how you slice it, occurred from May 1st to May 10th of 1992. On May 1st, Eucharistic fragments were placed into water, and they did not dissolve but turned reddish-brown by May 8th, and then at 2 masses on May 10th, several small drops of blood were noticed on the paten. If you want to count each instance of blood being found on a paten as a separate miracle and the Eucharistic fragments not dissolving, then that's 3 miracles between May 1st and 10th in 92, or you consider just the May 1992 miracles as one miracle. Then in July of 1994, priests noted blood dripping along the side of a tabernacle. And then in 1996, from August 15th until August 26th, is the main miracle. The Eucharist was placed into water. It did not dissolve, and it was this sample that was submitted for testing. No samples seem to exist from the occurrences in 92 or 94, though we do have pictures from 92. So this video was underselling the miracle because this really wasn't just one miracle. It was at least 3 distinct miracles that occurred on 3 separate years. But why am I saying that they also oversold it? Well, that's where I bring Dr. Zugaba back into the conversation. I may be mispronouncing his name, but I am borrowing from the Kiwi narrator of the video that I'm working with. Dr. Zugaba's work on this Eucharistic miracle was not peer-reviewed, and it was never published in any kind of scientific journal article. What's worse is that Dr. Zugaba is not an impartial source. In 1982, 2 decades before he was asked to analyze the sample, Dr. Zugaba published a book called The Cross and the Shroud, a medical inquiry into the crucifixion. So, an archbishop approaches a histologist who had written a book about the Shroud of Turin and says, "Please examine this specimen. Don't worry where it came from." And we're supposed to think that he didn't know that this was some kind of miracle investigation? Come on. And what's weird to me is that none of the Catholic sources that I looked at mentioned Dr. Zugaba being the author of a religious book. The original video doesn't mention it. The Jimmy Akin video does not mention it. Here's a video that I watched that is strictly about the Buenos Aires miracles that does not mention it. Here's an article from the Catholic National Register that doesn't mention it. And here's a Catholic pamphlet that doesn't mention it. In fact, I only found out about that book because I was looking into scientific journal articles that were written by Zugaba to see if he had written anything about Buenos Aires. I couldn't find anything that he wrote about those miracles, but I did find his popular level books about the Shroud of Turin and the Cross. But let's move past that oversight made by every single Catholic source, and instead, let's look at that pamphlet a little while longer. So this is a handy little 3-page pamphlet that is primarily consistent of the account given by Professor Castagnon regarding the Eucharistic miracle of 96, which he was in charge of investigating. It was Professor Castagnon who commissioned all of the testing being done on the samples. Now, when I say all of the testing, I say this because, again, the original video both oversold and undersold the work that was done on those samples. The only testing done wasn't done by Dr. Zugaba. There was testing done by other doctors as well. In fact, Dr. Zugaba was only the most recent testing, but there were plenty of tests done before. So, according to Professor Castagnon, the first tests done were not done in 2004 in the United States with Dr. Zugaba, but instead they were done in Argentina, which makes a lot more sense, right? The local testing was probably done first, and indeed it was. Dr. Lawrence was the first doctor to test the samples. These tests were conducted in Argentina in the year 2000, and the result of that test was that Dr. Lawrence said that he found human skin and white blood cells in the sample that he was given. You could read more about that here on the first page. You can see over, if you can see where my mouse is, it mentions in March of 2000, I was informed that the famous legal histopathologist Dr. Robert Lawrence, one of the top experts in tissues, would participate in the analysis. He feared it because he thought it would be expensive. Dr. Lawrence studied the samples and found in them human skin and white blood cells. In December of 2000, Dr. Lawrence told me that he could have obtained other samples of DNA. Okay, but we don't jump straight from Dr. Lawrence in the year 2000 straight to Zugaba in 2004. No. Believe it or not, in 2001, Dr. Linoli tested the sample. Dr. Linoli should sound familiar. In episode 1 of Eucharistic Miracles, we discussed Professor Linoli because he's the person who tested the samples from Italy. So in 2001, the professor went with samples to Professor Linoli, who identified the white blood cells and said to me that probably the samples corresponded with heart tissue. So that's interesting. In 2000 in Argentina, Dr. Lawrence studied the samples and said that it was human skin and white blood cells. Dr. Linoli in Italy in 2001 says it's heart tissue, not skin, and white blood cells. Interesting. Well, next, Dr. Walker in Australia. So again, Professor Linoli right here, white blood cells and heart tissue. Then in 2002, Professor John Walker in Australia, who confirmed that they showed muscle cells and intact white blood cells. So again, we have somebody else saying it's muscle tissue, but he's not saying whether it's skin or whether it's human heart necessarily. Then further down, we wind up going back to Dr. Lawrence. Let's find that. In September 2003, I went again to Professor Lawrence, who confirmed that in light of the new investigations, one could conclude that the sample could correspond to the tissue of an inflamed heart. Interesting. Dr. Lawrence is changing his tune after Dr. Linoli and Dr. Walker's investigations. Lastly, the sample was sent to Columbia University in New York in the United States to Frederick Zugaba. And Zugaba is the person who is quoted most often because he winds up saying some very religious sounding stuff. Professor Zugaba said to me, at the moment in which you brought me this sample, the heart was alive. His report sent out on March 26, 2005, 5.5 years after the start of the studies, and the conclusions were they are tissues of the heart undergoing degenerative changes of the myocardium, and these changes are due to the fact that the cells are inflamed, and it is the left ventricle of the heart. And then the studies concluded, and on March 17, 2006, the results were brought to, at the time, Cardinal Bergoglio. So, we have 5 different investigations with 4 different doctors getting different stories. Some saying it's skin, some saying it's heart tissue, some saying it's muscle but not specifying. And the fact that most of the videos leave all of this back and forth out and instead only focus on Zugaba is a little strange, isn't it? The way that Zugaba talks about the samples, you would think that this is a cut and dry case, but that is evidently not the case. There were doctors disagreeing on this. None of the work is published. None of it was peer review. So frankly, I don't know what to believe. So where does that leave us? The only real answer is I don't know. If I had to take a best guess at what happened, it would be something like this. In 1992, some kind of mold or bacteria was growing on the host in the water. There is a mold called Hydenlum peckii that looks a lot like blood or perhaps rotting human tissue. I think that the sample in 96 was sent to a team of only religious scientists. The first scientist found skin cells, which very well could have come from the priest who handled the Eucharist in the first place. But when other scientists, all religious, insisted that there was human heart tissue in the sample, the first scientist may have felt some religious pressure to get in line. He probably didn't want to be the one who spoiled the miracle for the rest of the world. Again, all of this is a hunch, but my theory doesn't require any kind of malintent by a priest or any scientist. There could just be legitimate mistakes being made and samples not being properly stored, which would lead to this exact outcome. But again, my only real answer is I don't know. I don't think that you know either. Pretending that you know that this is a miracle is probably not the most intellectually honest position. And with that, let's go to the tier list. This will likely come at a surprise to nobody, but Lanciano is losing its spot in S tier, being demoted to A tier, with Buenos Aires taking the spot in S tier. This is due to a lot of reasons, which are summarized on the next slide. First, Lanciano supposedly occurred in 750 AD, 1,220 years before the testing occurred. Only one opinion was given, and although this was published in a journal article, it wasn't peer-reviewed. The Buenos Aires miracles occurred from 92 to 96, only 4 to 8 years before the testing occurred. 4 different doctors gave their opinion, and although these were never published in a journal article or peer-reviewed, the rest of the criteria way favor Buenos Aires. So for that reason, Buenos Aires takes the spot in S tier. Thanks for watching, everybody. What Eucharistic miracle should I do next? Should I make a tier list of Eucharistic miracles sprinkled in with other miracles and apparitions? Should I make a giant tier list of all of the Catholic supernatural claims? Let me know. I'm really open to anything. But until next time, I've been Kevin Non-Tradicath, the non-traditional ex-Catholic, depending on how you define your terms. Thanks for watching.